please come to order? A quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 5933, the Deterrent Act. The chair announces that requests for recorded votes as to amendments may be postponed pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Without objection, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. Before turning to the legislative agenda today, I would like to first take a moment to address the critical moment facing our nation. In the Middle East, America's enemies are emboldened by the bloody war launched by Hamas on the 7th of October. According to Israeli authorities, the barbaric attack marked the single deadliest day in history for the citizens of Israel. Iran is empowered in the region thanks to our feckless leadership, and the situation in the Levant grows dire. In the Far East, our adversaries are watching carefully for signs of American weakness. China is emboldened by the rhetoric of extreme House Democrats who equivocate over the murder of women and children. China sees the division and hate growing out of ugly seeds of anti-Semitism as a window of opportunity. Anything but absolute moral clarity in the face of human atrocities emboldens our enemies. America must project strength and unity in these troubling times. Today, we have an opportunity to do just that by passing the Defending Education Transparency and Ending Rogue Regimes Engaging in Nefarious Transactions Deterrent Act. We can project strength to our adversaries. The Deterrent Act, authored by Representative Michelle Steele of California, will combat malign foreign influence on college campuses. The bill also includes many great policy ideas from other committee members, including Representatives Owens, Stefanik, Banks, James, and Wilson. In an age of unconventional warfare, post-secondary education is an easy target for adversaries seeking to steal our national security secrets and undermine our unifying national principles. Countries of concern, including Iran and China, leverage lavish gifts to our most prestigious universities to extract favors from top American academics. Some cases of foreign influence and espionage are clear-cut, like when the chair of Harvard's chemistry department, Dr. Charles Lieber, lied to the FBI about working at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and then later admitted to flying from Wuhan to Boston with over $50,000 in bags of cash. Other foreign influence operations are more clandestine. For instance, CCP-funded Confucius Institutes pose as innocuous cultural exchange centers, but are actually an integral pillar of the CCP's soft power strategy to undermine American traditions and values. A retired Politburo propaganda czar put it this way: Confucius Institutes, quote, are an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup, end quote. Political pressure has caused many Confucius Institutes to close in name, but many simply rebrand and maintain concerning partnerships. In the face of growing danger around the world, transparency and accountability in foreign gift reporting is desperately needed. A 2019 Senate report found that 70% of gifts from the CCP are not reported. Even when gifts are reported, the data is far from accurate or useful. In 2020, the department estimated Over 8.4 billion was reported as, quote, anonymous, end quote. And in 2022, the Lincoln Policy Network found nearly 30% of reports had no receipt date. If you received an anonymous deposit from Beijing or the Kremlin into your bank account, I promise the IRS would want to know about it. It is not a radical principle that universities should be held to the same standard as the American people. We deserve to know which countries are paying for influence on college campuses. The Deterrent Act secures transparency and accountability through 5 main pillars. First, it slashes the foreign gift reporting threshold from $250,000 to $50,000, with an even lower zero threshold for countries of concern. Second, it closes loopholes so foreign entities cannot hide the true origin or purpose of their gifts. Third, it requires public disclosure of foreign gifts to individual staff at research-heavy institutions. Fourth, it reveals foreign investments by the endowments of our largest private universities. And finally, it implements a stringent series of repercussions for colleges that remain non-compliant. At a time when our adversaries are emboldened, this committee must stand firm. I urge all our members to pass this bill and send a resounding message to our adversaries. We are strong, we are unified, and we will combat advances from our foreign enemies in any arena. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Scott, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. This bill, as I understand it, affects gifts to institutions of higher education and their employees, so I'll focus my remarks on the legislation. Global partnerships among academic institutions play a critical role in our social, economic, and innovative progress. Historically, collaborations with global partners and careful federal investments in research have enabled our universities to make bold, forward-thinking strides in health, science, and technology for people around the world. Furthermore, institutions across America have worked closely with the government to strengthen our research ecosystem through the recruitment and retention of researchers and scholars from other countries. These global partnerships help drive intellectual and campus diversity. They strengthen the inner workings of our economy, and they give us an undeniable competitive edge. We can all agree that institutions must be transparent about the resources they receive from foreign entities, particularly as the federal government invests roughly $30 billion annually in our higher education institutes' research and development efforts. Under Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, the Department of Education must collect and make publicly available certain information about foreign gifts and contracts involving institutions of higher education. This process is in place to promote public transparency about foreign funding in higher education and protect government funding activities from undue foreign influence, such as intellectual property theft and conflicts of interest. I'm pleased that the Biden administration has worked to improve the compliance with the law by returning Section 117 oversight responsibility to the Federal Student Aid Office. FSA already gathers data and statistics from roughly 6,000 institutions that take part in the student federal aid programs. Because of this move, on average, over 3,000 transactions and over $1.5 billion more per year have been reported under this administration than under the previous administration. This is just one piece of the president's work across the federal government to safeguard university-conducted research and prevent foreign influence and intellectual property theft. We should be building on this progress to develop sustainable, institutionalized responsibilities for Section 117 oversight. Unfortunately, after weeks of Republican-led dysfunction that immobilized the House, we're taking up a bill that fails to meaningfully address research security at our higher education institutions. Instead of helping institutions comply with the law, H.R. 5933 amends Section 117 to dramatically increase reporting requirements for institutions and faculty, while also restricting contracts with certain foreign entities. These added requirements only make it harder for institutions of higher education to fulfill their obligations under Section 117. As a result, this bill will hinder institutions from continuing to conduct critical research that has a global impact, as well as limit their ability to function as social, economic, and innovative hubs for which they are known. That's why Democrats will offer an amendment that provides institutions with a clear process for complying with their reporting requirements by aligning this bill with the work federal agencies are already doing to prevent undue foreign influence. And finally, I want to remind my colleagues again that achieving accountability and compliance can occur without contributing to anti-Asian, anti-Semitic, or Islamophobic animosity. As we've heard from our hearing witness earlier this year, our approach to confronting foreign influence in our academic institutions must be like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer to ensure that innocent Asian Americans are not unfairly targeted in an overall effort to combat a legitimate threat. Simply put, indiscriminate policies may cause more harm than good. We can and must take targeted, evidence-based steps to protect our research and development initiatives without jeopardizing the global partnerships that benefit us all. To that end, I urge my colleagues to support the Democratic amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require that a copy of the measure be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. Pursuant to the notice for today's meeting, a copy of the measure was made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. The bill being marked up today shall be open to amendment at any point, and the chair will allow members to offer amendments in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Without objection, members who have more than one amendment to a bill and wish to offer their amendments en bloc may do so. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 5933 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5933 to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to require additional information and disclosures of foreign gifts and contracts from foreign sources, restrict contracts with certain foreign entities and foreign countries of concern, require certain staff and faculty to report foreign gifts and contracts, and require disclosure of certain foreign investments within endowments.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize Congresswoman Steele to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. First, the clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933 offered by Mrs. Steele of California. Identifier Steele _055.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Congresswoman Steele for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Chairwoman Dr. Fox. I'm offering an amendment in the nature of substitute for the Deterrent Act, or H.R. 5933. This bill will protect students and academic institutions from malign foreign influence. We know our foreign adversaries love to hide in the shadows. Former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said that sunlight is the best of disinfectant. That is exactly what we are delivering with the Deterrent Act. I echo Chairman Chairwoman Fox's point, there is an urgent need to combat the growing threat of foreign influence on college campuses. The disclosure requirements under Section 117 play a vital role in this fight. While the previous administration reinvigorated the use of this tool, the Biden administration has unfortunately downplayed the threat of foreign actors and failed to take meaningful steps to protect our students, research, and national security. The Deterrent Act strengthens Section 117 in 3 key ways. The first pillar is transparency. Foreign adversaries look for any possible loophole to hide their true intentions. This is especially true for states that pose the greatest threat to our nation, like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The Deterrent Act eliminates those loopholes by lowering the foreign gifts reporting threshold from $250,000 to $50,000 for all foreign donors, and eliminating the threshold entirely for those from countries of concern. The bill also requires that disclosures include detailed information about the foreign source, the intent of the gift, and the complete text of any contracts with concerning entities. Before this committee in May, Secretary Cardona boasted about the quantity of Section 117 disclosures under this administration, but he failed to comment on the quality of these disclosures. Instead of empty numbers, the Deterrent Act Section 117 reforms will provide an American public with the transparency they deserve. The second pillar of my bill is accountability. For too long, schools have adopted a take money first, ask questions later approach to billions of dollars of foreign funds, as reporting and congressional oversight have revealed. In the case of UC Berkeley, in my home state of California, these problematic relationships are often discovered years after the fact, when the damage has already been done. Holding colleges and universities accountable for the foreign funds they receive means ensuring that the penalties for non-reporting are more than a slap on the wrist. The Deterrent Act proposes a scale of increasing fines and eventually the loss of Title IV funding for non-compliant universities. The Deterrent Act also set up an institutional point of contact so that institutions cannot use a faceless post-secondary bureaucracy to feign ignorance of unreported foreign funds on their campuses. It is time for responsibility. The third and final pillar of the Deterrent Act is clarity. The Deterrent Act includes many sensible provisions that streamline the bureaucratic reporting process and align Section 117 with other federal laws. The bill shifts the reporting time from biannual to annual and uses reporting thresholds and definitions from existing laws, such as the NDAA and the CHIPS Act, to avoid confusion. The Deterrent Act also ensures clear communication between the Department of Education and institutions. For example, it mandates that colleges and universities must have Section 117 point of contact at the department. It also requires periodic meetings between the department and institutions to discuss improvements to the online reporting process. My substitute amendment will strengthen each of these pillars. Specifically, it will clarify definitions of foreign sources and agents and ensure foreign corporations cannot hide in anonymity. My amendment also tweaks the deadline for report submissions to align better with other federal laws. Finally, my amendment fosters stronger coordination across agencies and between institutions. Combating malign foreign influence at our universities should not be a partisan issue. Section 117 has not been updated in more than 30 years.
Would the
These reforms are
gentlewoman close fairly soon, please?
almost done. Ignoring foreign influence at our institutions will hurt not only today's students, but also future generations. The Deterrent Act is a common sense bill that adds transparency, accountability, and clarify to Section 117. I urge the committee to adopt my amendment and vote yes on Deterrent Act, and I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Ms. Jayapal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly oppose this dangerous, xenophobic, and unworkable bill that would effectively weaponize the Department of Education against America's colleges and stifle breakthroughs in technology, research, climate change, and medicine, all while increasing racial profiling and hate towards the Asian American community. No one on this committee takes the threat of undue foreign influence and espionage lightly in our nation's schools, and neither do our premiers, universities in our nation who participate in critical research efforts. But instead of making it easier for universities to comply with the law, the Deterrent Act only adds more requirements for the sake of adding more requirements without increasing security. It also makes benevolent actions publicly available without much benefit. Under the bill, individuals may be required to list the names and addresses of every foreign funding source coming from another person. If an American researcher accepted something as trivial as a cup of coffee from a researcher in China, they would be required to put their name and address into an online database. Every day, innocuous things like splitting a taxi or giving someone a stick of gum would put people in the crosshairs of this bill. Since the database does not differentiate which transactions are suspicious, honest individuals would be presented alongside activities that are actually worrying, like a professor failing to disclose additional foreign income, and would be presented as engaging in concerning behavior for simply following the law. Failure to report even the most minor transaction could be extremely costly. For example, if the University of Washington in my district fails to report a covered transaction, they could be levied a fine of $36 million for a first-time violation. America's colleges want to be transparent with their foreign funding sources and comply. They should not be punished for struggling to understand the nuances of foreign funding reporting and the additional requirements that are now imposed in this bill. That is why they have consistently requested clarity, transparency, and guidelines behind reporting regulations that have not been updated in nearly 4 decades. But this legislation does not take those concerns into consideration. Again, there are legitimate security concerns that we should address to protect federally funded research. Colleges share that concern, and they want to be partners on this. But we need a precise response to mitigating that so that we both make it easier for colleges to be transparent and we avoid bias and discrimination that would deter the world's best and brightest from coming to our colleges. American universities remain the crown jewel of the world because we welcome the talent of the sharpest minds from across the globe. And we all benefit because of it. But broad approaches like these only encourage these students to forego enriching America to enroll at less antagonistic countries. Doing this in a way that induces suspicion only fans the flames of hate against Asian Americans. 1 in 4 Americans believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of ethnicity than to the United States. That kind of sad thinking breeds the type of climate in our nation today where half of Asian Americans no longer feel safe here because of their race. The rhetoric behind this legislation, the idea that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners, is what fueled tragedies like the internment of Japanese Americans and backlash against Asian Americans during the COVID pandemic, among other horrific incidents. We can't continue to make the same mistakes. Ultimately, we should work together on bipartisan solutions to encourage international collaboration with the necessary safeguards to our institutions. Instead of taking the opportunity to address actual obstacles to improving transparency in foreign funding, this bill just erects more barriers to encouraging those meaningful partnerships. These academic ventures are essential to our nation's competitiveness and have clear impacts for our economy. During the 2021 school year alone, my district had more than 11,000 international students enrolled who went on to contribute $456 million to our economy. And that's just my district. Our diplomatic strategy and America's longevity depends on how we manage our international relationships. Our standing in the world and the strength of our economy depends on our ability to attract the best and brightest around the world to study and work here. They have chosen to come here because of the democratic ideals that we embrace, the quality of our education system, and the belief that America is a country that will embrace them. And just as they embrace America, we should embrace their contributions and support improvements to help colleges comply with foreign funding requirements, not this bill. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, who led us to understand about the Confucius Institutes a long time ago, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman Virginia Fox, and thank you for your visionary leadership. Additionally, I support H.R. 5933, which is so important, as led by the very important Congresswoman Michelle Steele of California, and I urge the committee to pass the bill. The Deterrent Act makes critical updates to improve transparency, accountability, and clarity in higher education at a time when our nation's students are at the forefront of subversive foreign influence. This bill closes reporting loopholes so foreign entities cannot hide the true malicious purpose of their funding. As well, it holds our wealthiest institutions accountable, revealing the foreign investments in the endowments of our largest private universities. I was grateful to have worked with Congressman Ralph Norman of South Carolina to close the Confucius Institutes across the state of South Carolina. These institutes were clearly acknowledged to be the propaganda arms of the Chinese Communist Party, and it was a crucial step in safeguarding our nation from the threat of the Chinese Communist Party influence, which oppresses the people of China. And I have a special appreciation for the people of China. My father served First Lieutenant Hugh Wilson in the 14th Air Force Flying Tigers in China. So I grew up with a great appreciation of the people of China. He served in Kunming, Chengdu, and Xi'an. And as I was growing up, he told me how talented the people of China are, who are currently being oppressed, indeed, by the Chinese Communist Party. And sadly, we're in a war we did not choose, of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. It began with war criminal Putin mass murder in Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Then the Iran puppets on October 7th committed massacre in Israel, with the Chinese Communist Party threatening the 24 million people of Taiwan. And sadly, to make it even clearer and more sad, the New York Post reported last week that indeed American families are at greater risk of attack today since 9/11, a potential attack imminent here within the United States. We know that the bad actors will continue to use our nation's college campuses to influence students and undermine national interest, and we must respond aggressively and take these threats seriously. We need to know that support for the Iran puppet Hamas endorses its 1988 Hamas covenant. In the midst of the insane provisions of the Hamas covenant, Article 7, quote, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him.'" End of quote. That's their plan. Their plan, indeed, is death to Israel death to America. We must not be looking over this. It's real, and it's today. I urge the committee to pass the bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate the chair's concerns about foreign influence in higher education and thank her for hosting today's markup. And I hope that we can also take time to work on our respective shared bipartisan priorities in the higher education space as well. The Higher Education Act of 1965 is one of our country's greatest legislative achievements in support of working Americans seeking to better themselves and their families through education, as well as one of the reasons why our university system is widely recognized as the most prestigious in the world. It's the legislative framework that has resulted in so many international students wanting to be the best at what they do and knowing that they need to come here to gain those skills to do it. This August, we hit the 15-year anniversary of the last reauthorization of the Higher Education Act and are now coming up on 10 years since its expiration at the end of 2013. And while anniversaries are normally a thing to be celebrated, this anniversary marks our continued inability as a Congress to do what we have always done when it comes to HEA and come together in a bipartisan manner to reauthorize this critically important law. The Higher Education Act has been reauthorized in 1968, 1972, 1976, 1980, 1986, 1998, and in 2008, as I just mentioned. And I know that the differences between our parties seem vast, but I also know that there's more that brings us together than pulls us apart. In heaven, I pray that is the case. The last reauthorization of HEA, known as the Higher Education and Opportunity Act, passed the House 354 to 58, with over 200 Democrats and 130 Republicans supporting it, a true bipartisan showing. We have done this so many times before, and I know that we all have it within ourselves to do it again, and there again, I hope and I pray. From taking steps to address the disturbing prevalence of deadly hazing incidents on campus, to fulfilling the promise to ensure that every American have access to higher education regardless of their income, there is so much that we can do together if we choose. So much that folks back home are expecting us to come through for them on so many different policies. They are waiting for us to get our act together. Folks like Steve and Rayanne Groover from my home state of Georgia, who lost their son Max in a hazing incident in 2017. Or like Julie and Gary DeVolsterly, who lost their son, Gary Jr., over 15 years ago in 2007, and they have been fighting ever since to honor his legacy and make important changes at the federal level that provide parents with the peace of mind that their children are being kept safe after they drop them off on their first day of college. I do truly look forward to working with the committee on these issues at the appropriate time, and I thank the chair and the ranking member for their important work. I truly do hope that we can put the partisan politics aside and do what's best for the American people. They deserve far better than what they're getting. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. McBath. Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm proud to speak today in support of the Deterrent Act, introduced by my good friend from California, Michelle Steele. In recent years, we've heard of concerning incidents involving foreign actors where research is stolen from our universities, propaganda is permeated on college campuses, and free speech has come under attack. These attacks are direct threats on our national security, quality of education, and the values that we hold dear as Americans. The Deterrent Act is much-needed legislation that protects America's higher education against the malicious foreign influences. The Deterrent Act preserves American security, academic freedom by requiring greater transparency and accountability from colleges and universities. This increased transparency and accountability will weaken the grip of foreign influences and discourage institutions of higher learning from establishing partnerships that they would rather hide from the public. Furthermore, any institution that fails to meet these reporting requirements will face financial penalties and will become increasingly greater for repeat offenders. I'm also proud that my Reporting on Investments in Foreign Adversaries RIFA Act has been included in this legislation. The RIFA Act creates transparency requirements for private colleges and universities that utilize their endowments to invest in viable countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This transparency will hold private institutions accountable for their financial partnerships with dangerous countries and entities. Since 2013, U.S. colleges and universities have received more than $1 billion in gifts and contracts from the Chinese Communist Party affiliated sources. As a result, professors, student groups, and guest speakers critical of Chinese government human rights abuses have been silenced, threatened, and deplatformed. The Chinese regime is spreading anti-democracy and anti-American propaganda by funneling large sums of money into higher education. Unfortunately, we have American citizens, Americans, administrators, who are on the taxpayer dime, have turned their backs on our country. With no shame, they give the evil, manipulative, and repressive Communist China regime easy and paid-for access to our children. This internal attack and betrayal by educational institutions that we once trusted is totally unacceptable and must stop now. Presently, these same institutions are proudly divesting from fossil fuel and being pressured to join the boycott, divest, and sanction Israel movement. They should be equally willing to disclose all problematic anti-American relationships to the public and to serve them. The Deterrent Act and the incorporated RIFA Act are concrete steps to strengthen our institutions against foreign influence that seeks to undermine our education, take advantage of our youth, and rob us of our intellectual property. For the sake of our nation and its citizens, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Today, I want to speak in opposition to H.R. 5933, the Deterrent Act. This bill would decrease the foreign gift reporting threshold for colleges and universities from $250,000 to $50,000. It would require disclosure of foreign gifts and contracts of individual staff and faculty, and it would force private institutions with endowments over $6 million to list those investments among other provisions. These measures are too restrictive for our colleges and universities, and this would discourage collaboration with foreign entities. Although we agree that transparency, accountability, and clarity in gift reporting from foreign entities is important, we also want to make sure that we aren't preventing institutions of higher education from being able to engage with others. Maintaining academic openness and collaboration in academia allows us to engage with bright individuals from all over the world. Institutions of higher education have been hubs of research and development that advances scientific knowledge in this country. A common goal of university research is to enhance the global perspective on certain issues that impact society beyond our nation's borders. So how can we continue to advance this knowledge without working together? Institutions of higher education receive $30 billion annually from the federal government to support research and development efforts, which only accounts for 60% of their total R&D funding. This means that diverse funding streams are necessary and conducive to advancing research. The entities that provide the largest dollar amount in gifts to these institutions are from Qatar, England, and Canada, and they account for over half of the amounts disclosed reporting to the Department of Education. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle consistently attack China. They've stated that Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, loose legislative language, Biden's blatant crippling of enforcement efforts, and institutions' refusal to adhere to the law have resulted in billions of dollars in foreign funds infiltrating our country undetected. This couldn't be further from the truth. The Department of Education has already been taking steps to ensure that institutions of higher education are compliant with the law. The department has recently created a website containing written guidance for colleges and universities, along with webinars and other content to assist them in their reporting. Additionally, the Chips and Sciences Act requires these institutions to report financial information to the National Science Foundation about foreign countries of concern, and the NSF is directed to create guardrails concerning the talent program. This bill would make it more difficult for our universities to engage with foreign influence. It is important that we protect the ability of these institutions to conduct research, which is the goal of Section 117. We need to encourage relationships with foreign countries, but we also need to find an effective way of protecting our students from harm. This bill will not do that. So I encourage my colleagues to vote against it. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Mr. Good, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Today, we consider the Deterrent Act, legislation strengthening existing law that requires colleges to publicly report the donations and contracts they receive from foreign countries. The funding of higher education needs increased transparency and accountability on multiple levels. In a 2020 investigation, the Trump administration found that $6.5 billion in previously unreported foreign money went to universities from adversarial countries. The department also stated that $8.4 billion in foreign money was anonymously reported and received in the last decade. Meanwhile, universities in the U.S. hold $807 billion in endowments, while parents and students struggle under the hyperinflationary and exorbitant rising costs of college, and they have $1.6 trillion in student loans outstanding to show for it. The average tuition for 1 year at a public college is now $26,000, while the cost of a year at a private school is now about $56,000. To summarize, colleges are accepting foreign money, and they have huge endowments that they certainly aren't using to help keep tuition and other prices low, and the cost of higher education continues to explode. But meanwhile, the federal government doles out more and more taxpayer money to fund degrees that too often fail to provide an adequate ROI, but those taxpayer dollars do fund lots of non-academic offices and positions, advance a radical leftist agenda on our campuses, and indoctrinate vulnerable young people with an anti-American, anti-free enterprise, anti-traditional values mindset. Education is a battleground for influence over the next generation of Americans, and unfortunately, our foreign adversaries understand this very well. The Deterrent Act lowers the threshold of reporting foreign contributions and requires more transparency for contracts entered into between colleges and foreign governments and entities. All this information would be available on a publicly searchable database so that students and parents can see the financial connections to foreign adversaries at their school. Available data tells a story that aligns with current events. Many of the top donor countries are not aligned with the American values of the respect for life, the rule of law, basic morality, and individual liberty. Let's consider the top donor nation to U.S. colleges, Qatar, who was just mentioned by the previous speaker from the other side, trying to contrast that with China, I might add. Well, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy found a correlation between the funding of universities by Qatar and the active presence of groups such as the Students for Justice in Palestine at those universities. We shouldn't be surprised at the offensive anti-Semitic remarks we've seen from students, professors, and administrators when we know that billions of dollars have flowed to these schools from a Qatar government who says that, quote, Israel alone is responsible, end quote, for the attack by Hamas and Qatar actually provides an office for Hamas in its capital city. International partnerships can be beneficial for universities, but they should not come at the cost of our national security, our intellectual property, our academic freedom, or our traditional American values. I support passage of the Deterrent Act, and I hope this committee will continue to expose and work to diminish, if not eliminate, interference by foreign adversaries on our college campuses. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to hear that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle mention their concerns over the involvement of countries like Qatar in donations to institutions of higher education, and that the focus is not just on countries like such as China. As the global geopolitical threats and the perceived threats change, we've seen members of this committee shift also their focus. Prior to this, we heard almost exclusive concern about China, and there is reason to be concerned about our geopolitical rival, China. But I wanted to also remind folks about some of the more subtle things we also need to be paying attention to. 46% of PhD students as of 2020, this is 2020, 46% of PhD students in science and technology were foreign students. Chinese students from abroad were the largest, 37%. 87% of that 37%, so getting a little confusing, were Chinese graduate students that stayed in the United States. They constitute a significant part of the American science and technology labor force. I remind my colleagues that when we talk about a workforce that we need to build in this country, to build chips in our country, we're not talking just about factory workers, we're talking about PhD level engineers. Where do you think we're going to get all of this workforce who are skilled and trained at a high level? Where are we going to find all of that? We should be developing at our nascent capacity with our own native-born Americans, but clearly with nearly half, as of 2020, of students seeking advanced degrees in science and technology, they come from places like China. And very often, these students, while you may want to suspect them of stealing technology, they may also need our protection. And we may be unwittingly subjecting their private information so that it makes them easier to be targets of monitoring by foreign entities that want to harm them. There are documented cases where the People's Republic of China actually target the Chinese diaspora here in America. I can see my colleague nodding his head. He knows about those circumstances. So we need to be very careful about how we construct laws like this. Now, I only have a couple minutes left, but I want to focus on the practical aspects of this bill. This bill puts onus on the Department of Education to do an additional layer of review on top of what has already been directed by a national, the NSPM, I forget the acronym for that, the National Security, anyway, the NSPM, it's like an executive order issued by the president. It was authored by President Trump. And actually compliance with that Trump order has increased significantly under President Biden by the institutions of higher learning. And the intent of that order was to standardize and make very clear what the compliance needed to be done. It was confusing prior to this. Institutions of higher learning who wanted to comply were having difficulty and were getting caught up in not submitting the right things. I ask us to slow this down so that we can get this right and we don't do unnecessary things. Normally, my Republican colleagues are very wary about over-regulating and doing too much. I would suggest to you that we need to do more careful scrutiny of what we're doing because we could actually do harm to the very workforce, highly skilled and highly trained workforce that will keep our nation's edge in science and technology. So I understand the intent of my colleague from California, but I request that we, in a more bipartisan way, section by section, look at the legitimate concerns of Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants who, on the balance, are a great asset to our country. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tucano. Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, and thank you, Congresswoman Steele, for leading this important legislation. First of all, to my colleague on the left, he said he understood the intent of this legislation. Well, you are actually misrepresenting the intent. This is not about students. This is about money coming from nations that are a national security threat to us. This bill establishes a zero-tolerance policy toward nations that pose a national security threat, such as China and Iran. It requires full transparency if these adversarial nations contribute even a single dollar to any of our colleges or universities. During 2018 and 2019, Joe Biden's Penn Biden Center at the University of Pennsylvania received more than $500,000 from a group with ties to the Communist Party of China. The House Oversight Committee also discovered that the University of Pennsylvania paid Joe Biden $900,000 during this very same period. A new report yesterday by Barry Weiss also highlights that at least 200 American colleges and universities withheld information on $13 billion from foreign regimes, with much of that coming from the Middle East. Pro-Hamas groups have gained a foothold in our colleges, very sadly. And the colleges and universities raking in money from the Middle East appear to be ignoring Title VI while they allow Jewish students to be threatened and harassed on campus. H.R. 5933 holds taxpayer-funded colleges and universities accountable. It requires public disclosure of foreign gifts to individual staff and reveals foreign investments and endowments. We must protect students, universities, and our American values by eliminating foreign influence on college campuses. Again, I want to thank Congresswoman Steele and Chairwoman Fox, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mrs. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. I rise in opposition of the Deterrent Act. The Deterrent Act would hinder participation in research by signaling to researchers and institutions that scientific collaboration is discouraged and effectively deterring academic institutions from engaging with immigrant colleagues and peers from, quote, countries of concern, out of fear or punishment of heightened scrutiny. While I believe protecting the security of our institutions of higher education is imperative to safeguard our national security, the Biden administration and the Department of Education are already focused on strengthening foreign influence. Section 117 of the Higher Education Act already mandates this type of reporting. In February 2023, during a House Education and Workforce Committee hearing, Secretary Cardona stated the Department of Education had received over 34,000 filings in the past 2 years and was on track to receive the most Section 117 reports of any administration. Additionally, the institutions of higher education are implementing new requirements for institutions under the recently passed CHIPS and Science Act. The Deterrent Act would require institutions to receive a waiver from the Department of Education before beginning a contract with any, quote, country of concern. The Department of Education does not currently have the expertise to carry out the review of contracts for waivers, many of which will likely focus on scientific research, not under the jurisdiction of the department. Furthermore, this legislation does not appropriate any additional funds for the Department of Education, while simultaneously asking them to take on these additional responsibilities. House Democrats remain committed to defending American universities against foreign influence, but I am disappointed that this is the only bill we are marking up today. Roughly 453,000 workers have gone on strike so far in 2023, yet we have not passed a single piece of legislation to strengthen labor rights. Nearly 9 in 10 public school districts are struggling to hire teachers heading into the next school year, yet we have not passed a single piece of legislation to address the teacher shortage. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, has not been reauthorized since it expired in 2020, yet this committee has not held a single hearing to discuss federal investments in workforce development. I urge this committee to take on the issues that affect everyday Americans and will be immediately felt by our students. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Mr. Burleson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to voice my strong support for the Deterrent Act, which I think is a vital piece of legislation that addresses a very pressing issue threatening our nation's education system and our national security. See, America's colleges and universities are under threat by foreign adversaries who are actively seeking to exploit our academic institutions for purposes that go against the interests of the American people. The bill before us offers a comprehensive solution to this threat, bringing transparency, accountability, and clarity to the foreign gift reporting requirements for our colleges and universities. You see, the infiltration of foreign influence into our education system is extremely concerning. Foreign adversaries, notably the Chinese Communist Party, have exploited loopholes in our laws, providing American academic institutions with substantial funding opportunities. And why? So that they can have access to steal the research and intellectual property being done that's funded by the United States and in our American institutions. In my own home state, I had conversations directly with university leaders who told me hair-raising stories that should cause us all to be concerned about the effort of the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate our research centers, even in a state like Missouri. One example of concern is Confucius Institute, which are Chinese government-funded cultural and language programs hosted by universities worldwide. U.S. officials have raised concerns about these programs' relationship to the PRC, their sources of funding, and the potential for undue PRC influence or risks to the national security, which is according to a GAO study that was released just last week. This same study notes that there are just a handful of Confucius Institutes left in the U.S., down from an estimated 120. And so, Madam Chair, I would request that we enter into this reference GEO study into the committee record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. While I'm pleased that most of these programs have now been terminated, I believe that further investigation, that we need to investigate the impact of foreign programs like the Confucius Institute that we have had. We should also put protections in place to prevent similar programs from infiltrating our universities in the future. That's exactly what this legislation does. By holding institutions accountable, the Deterrent Act protects the individuals targeted the most by our adversaries, requiring disclosure of foreign gifts and contracts to staff and faculty at heavy research institutions. This act also demands accountability from our largest private institutions, forcing them to reveal concerning foreign investments in their endowments. This critical step ensures that even the most prestigious institutions are not exempt from transparency. To enforce compliance, the legislation imposes fines and potential loss of Title IV funding for colleges and universities that fail to report foreign gifts, which will send a strong message that non-compliance will not be tolerated. By passing this legislation, we're going to send a resounding message that our education system is not for sale. It's not for sale to the highest bidder, and we will not allow foreign adversaries to compromise our academic freedom, our research integrity, and our national security. I urge each member of this committee to support the Deterrent Act, standing together in defense of our nation's education system and the students who represent its future. Let us act decisively, safeguarding the integrity of our academic institutions and preserving the sanctity of American education for generations to come. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues for your attention and consideration for this important piece of legislation. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Burleson. Mr. James, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I would like to speak in support of Congresswoman Steele's Deterrent Act. Constituents in my district are rightly concerned about CCP influence coming from two fronts: by President Biden and his team's appeasement to China in order to enact their Green New Deal agenda, and comply or die EV mandates on the backs of working families in my state, and Governor Whitmer's willingness to sell out Michigan to CCP-linked companies. For this reason, Michigan Republicans have taken the threat of the CCP's influence seriously and will continue to do so. To that end, I will pose this question: why are we funding two sides of this rivalry? Why are we welcoming the fox into the henhouse? No pun intended, Madam Chairwoman. We must do more to disentangle from the CCP and hold this administration accountable to uphold that standard. Last month, I introduced the Disclose Gift Act to require faculty and staff at colleges and universities to report gifts and contracts from foreign nations of concern. I want to thank Chairwoman Fox and her team for working on this legislation with me and for including it into this legislation. For too long, our foreign adversaries like Chinese Communist Party have infiltrated academia to spy on the United States, steal our information, gain a foothold in our government, and twist the minds of our young people. The national security implications should alarm all Americans. If faculty and staff at American institutions are under foreign influence, the least we can do is ensure that we are aware of it and monitoring it. This is not a standard that my colleagues here in Congress do not abide. I hope that you can support what I believe to be common sense accountability, regardless of where you are or where you're from. Why do institutions play by different rules than the rest of America? If we have foreign interests, we must disclose it at every level of influence. I ask my colleagues to support the Deterrent Act, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. James. Are there any other members who wish to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, seek to be recognized?
Madam Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
No.
I'm sorry, Madam Speaker.
Does the gentlewoman have an amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Thank you. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933, offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina, identifier MANNIN036.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you. Malign foreign influence is a very real problem in our colleges and universities, and I applaud the members of this committee for working to address this issue. However, the Deterrent Act, as written, unfortunately fails to create a system in which universities and the government may work collaboratively to address foreign influence. Instead, it creates unnecessary administrative load for universities, creates a chilling effect on the U.S. researchers from participating in important international scientific collaborations, and most disturbingly, implements policies that may have negative repercussions for American national security. I'm specifically referring to the changes to Section 117B of the Higher Education Act. The Deterrent Act requires institutions to create a public, searchable database of foreign gifts and any contract entered into with a foreign country or entity of concern. That includes any contract with a value of 0 or more, which essentially opens this requirement to faculty working with international partners on any type or scope of project. The names of faculty submitting the disclosure would be available on the database, and most notably, the legislation specifically requires that the database must be searchable by the names of faculty. This is extremely concerning. I'm also a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, as are other members of this committee. I feel that beyond the national security implications of this policy should be clear. Beyond that, we should be concerned about the implications for faculty safety and privacy. I believe that this misguided policy will empower our adversaries while also creating a chilling effect on those faculty and staff that would not want their names personally subjected to this level of scrutiny by the government and the public. If we are working to undermine malign foreign influence in universities, why are we creating a searchable database that spotlights specific faculty and staff to be targeted by foreign adversaries? Why are we opening up those faculty and staff to potential harassment on the basis of their contracts? We are living in a time of rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia, rising anti-Asian hate, and providing the names of individual faculty members in this particular context could expose these members to harassment, hate crimes, and violence. The public listing of the names of individual faculty and staff members is not necessary to achieve the goals of this legislation. Moreover, a database of the relevant information already exists. The Department of Education manages a public, searchable database in which contracts are visible under the names of the institution, not the name of the individual researcher. For that reason, I have introduced an amendment to remove this database requirement. Congress's goals must be to encourage institutional compliance, not to subject individuals to targeting or attacks. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment and remove this harmful policy from the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I oppose this amendment. While my Democrat colleagues claim that requiring public disclosures of contracts and gifts received by faculty from foreign entities is an invasion of privacy, they ignore the fact that these individuals are happy to voluntarily publish their own names, their email addresses, and their donors when it comes to their own published works. These individuals are funded directly or indirectly by taxpayer dollars, and taxpayers should have every right to know how those dollars are being spent. Let me be clear. This disclosure requirement is not about stifling collaboration or invading privacy. It's about transparency. Without public transparency, foreign adversaries will have no reason to stop trying to influence faculty with gifts. And if faculty working on sensitive research have nothing to hide when it comes to the foreign actors they are collaborating with, then transparency shouldn't be an issue. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, pass H.R. 5933, and I yield back. Does any member wish to speak on the amendment offered by Ms. Manning? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition? No, who's got the other amendment? Another amendment. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question on the amendment by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Oh, the gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I won't use the whole 5 minutes. First of all, I just want to start by saying that I think this is an important bill. We're at a moment right now in terms of our country where I think this is a topic that really we have to look at and address. And I would note that in October, the Five Eyes countries, in terms of which is really the core of our intelligence collecting
and collaboration with allies, Australia, UK, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. There was a conference in Stanford University recently where they raised basically publicly the issue of what's going on right now in terms of theft of intellectual property and critical technologies. And as a member of the House Armed Services Committee, where we are obviously in the center of that, we are seeing, again, critical technologies, whether it's quantum computing, hypersonics, artificial intelligence, which is now really the name of the game in terms of really trying to stay ahead of rising threats. And that's just a fact. That's not something that anyone, I think, is happy about, but it's just a reality. And the Five Eyes leaders, who again are basically are in charge of the internal security of those 5 nations. It was an extraordinary gathering. 60 Minutes had an interview, Scott Pelley did, with all 5 of them, where they basically chimed in. The head of the Australian security service basically he said right here, he said that all countries spy, our countries spy, all governments have a need to be covertly informed. All countries seek strategic advantage. But the behavior that we're talking about here in terms of what China has been doing in terms of intellectual property threat goes well beyond traditional espionage. The scale of threat is unprecedented in human history. And again, every single other representative of the countries echoed that. And academic institutions is where some of this cutting edge technology is being developed, is a target. I mean, that's just, as I said, a reality. Having said that, this bill is not the 10 Commandments. I think we should have, real back and forth here in terms of trying to fashion, I think language that really makes sense. And again, I think Ms. Manning's amendment, which is really focused on the fact that, having faculty member individuals disclosed, in my opinion, does not achieve the goal of what I think the country needs in terms of making sure that academic institutions are part of the effort to really reduce the threat of intellectual property theft. So I'm going to support her amendment. I hope, again, we can, all of us can work together to try and come up with a product here that achieves the goal that the Five Eyes leaders really raised the alarm on. By the way, Australia did exactly this same effort in terms of their colleges and universities, because they realize that they are inevitably connected to the competition that's there, and they are literally at China's doorstep. A great ally of our country. The Prime Minister was just here last week, and again talked to a lot of us on the Hill about, again, what they're up against there. And again, colleges and universities are part of this issue. I mean, inevitably. So again, I support the amendment. Madam Chair, I would ask to have the 60 Minutes article about the issue that I just discussed, China stealing technology secrets from AI to computing and biology's Five Eyes intelligence leaders warn and ask that it be admitted to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Manning.
Madam Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentlewoman requests a recorded vote. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment to desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933 offered by Mr. Thompson of Pennsylvania, identifier THOMPA_052.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. This legislation is an important step towards protecting our national security. Our nation is home to many of the top academic institutions in the world, leading the way on groundbreaking research in healthcare, energy production, engineering, and agriculture. Unfortunately, that makes these institutions prime targets for foreign adversaries to exert their influence and potentially compromise American research and intellectual property. The Deterrent Act will help mitigate these threats by increasing transparency in foreign investments, closely scrutinizing any gifts or contracts from countries of concern, and implementing concrete enforcement actions for noncompliance. Of course, for any of these policies to have an impact, institutions must accurately report required information under Section 117. And many colleges and universities in my district have told me that the current reporting system at the Department of Education is outdated, burdensome, and difficult to interact with. While I was happy to see important improvements in the underlying bill, including requiring a single point of contact at the department to provide technical assistance to institutions, I believe more can be done to ensure institutions are able to fully comply with these necessary reforms. Now, this amendment would allow institutions to report all necessary gifts and contracts by uploading one file to the department's database. Currently, institutions are often required to report each eligible gift or contract one by one to the department, creating a cumbersome and bureaucratic process that is inefficient. By improving the user interface to allow for batch reporting, institutions will be able to more easily comply with reporting requirements outlined in this legislation. Additionally, my amendment would better define the user group in the underlying bill to include institutions across the higher education system to ensure the department hears and considers feedback from a comprehensive group of users. Finally, this amendment further clarifies how often the Department of Education must meet with the user group, requires all recommendations offered by the group to be published online, and mandates that the department respond to each suggestion as to whether or not it will be implemented. All the provisions in my amendment further increase accountability within the department and provide institutions with the necessary resources to fully comply with the provisions in this legislation. I urge all my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strike move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I appreciate gentleman from Pennsylvania's amendment. It clarifies exactly how the process will work, and I think it is helpful. I particularly like the establishment of a standing user group that allows for stakeholder engagement. There can be some unintended consequences from the legislation, and this group could certainly bring those to light. So I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, then if there's no further debate on the amendment, the question on the amendment by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk, Scott VA _ 022. I have two amendments at the desk. 022 is the one I want brought up.
The clerk will report the amendments.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933 offered by Mr. Scott, Virginia, identifier SCOTVA _ 022.
The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his first amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, as it's been pointed out, for many countries, the threshold limit is 0, which means you're dealing with anything. Although I appreciate the bill's exemption from, I guess, declarations, I'm concerned that as written, faculty and other covered individuals will be expected to report a multitude of gifts that have 0 impact on the national security of our country. And my amendment would exclude widely attended events, receptions, charity events, and gifts of personal responsibility from the definition of a gift. If this is not agreed to, there are going to be situations where people buying coffee or for the group or anything, you've got to start reporting it. And if a person of national origin other than the United States is offering, everybody's got to look at themselves and, oh God, can I take this? Do I have to report and get my name on the list of suspicious individuals? Madam Chair, we've all heard about the problems that occur under the jurisdiction of the Foreign Affairs Committee, or the dangers of foreign influence at colleges and universities. And I think we generally agree on those. This amendment is designed to just make the reporting that's in the bill more workable and less likely to provoke Asian hate and other unintended consequences. I'd hope we'd adopt the amendment. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? If not, I'd like to yield myself 5 minutes to speak in opposition to the amendment. While I appreciate the spirit of this amendment, we need to be extremely careful when creating and expanding exemptions for foreign gifts. Exemptions for things such as widely attended events and receptions may seem reasonable, but it's critical to recognize that foreign adversaries with malicious motives will do anything and everything to exploit loopholes in statute when given the chance, through vague language like personal hospitality. That said, I want to reiterate that I agree with the spirit behind this amendment, and while I plan to oppose the amendment at this time, I'm happy to work further with the ranking member and all of my Democrat colleagues on this topic as the bill moves through the process. Thank you. I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? If not, the time, there's time for a question on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. No. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. The gentleman requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933, offered by Mr. Moran of Texas, identifier MORATX_037.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My amendment seeks to make just a few changes to ensure that institutions with existing contracts under this bill with foreign entities or entities of concern have clarity on the waiver process and enough time to request one from the Department of Education if they choose to do so. We've got a great intent by this bill, but we do not want to be overly burdensome to our colleges and universities in the way it is actually put in place. Specifically, my amendment would require that colleges and universities submit their full text of their existing contracts and be given a grace period from the date of enactment. By providing a grace period that would either expire the sooner of 1 year after enactment or when the existing contract expires, institutions will have the opportunity to request a waiver while also maintaining the transparency requirements that this bill seeks to accomplish. Additionally, my amendment makes changes to address concerns that the Department of Education will not have the necessary resources to vet the waiver requests on a timely basis. In balancing those concerns, as well as the overall intention of this bill, my amendment would change the deadline for requesting a waiver for institutions to 120 days before entering into the contract, and require that the Department of Education respond 60 days prior to institutions entering into that contract. Same timelines would govern renewals when existing contracts approach their expiration as well. Overall, it's just important that institutions receive clear expectations for the waiver process, and my amendment seeks to do just that. With that, I urge the support of my amendment, and I yield back the remainder of my time with thanks in particular to those institutions in the state of Texas that provided us feedback going through this process, and to the staff as well, working through to make sure that we could make this bill one that was workable both for the institutions and for the intent overall to keep our institutions safe, our intellectual property safe, and keep foreign entities from having malign influence in our educational institutions in America. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. It has identified a glitch in the bill. If someone has an existing contract that now is covered because we passed the bill, they're given time to get themselves straight. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and also gives a little more time when waivers are requested. I appreciate the gentleman's amendment and hope it's adopted. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Texas. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk. It's designated threshold_01.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933 offered by Mr. Scott, Virginia, identifier threshold_01.
The gentleman from Virginia, ranking member, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this is a fairly simple amendment. It just establishes, reduces the present law threshold of $250,000 to $25,000 for everybody. It doesn't get you into the quagmire of people in social situations, visiting someone's house and getting coffee, having to wonder whether or not if a previous amendment does not pass, that kind of coffee would be a reportable gift on which you have to put your name on a list of, I guess, suspicious-looking individuals. If we're going after corruption, I think we're at a level that indicates corruption. Coffee and sharing donuts is not the kind of thing we're talking about. And we're not just talking about contracts, we're talking about every kind of different kind of gift. This would restore the language to $25,000 rather than the $250,000, so there would be a significant increase in the number of people covered, but not everybody in what could be really social situations. If you are putting people in that kind of situation where they can't, where they're suspicious about accepting, someone comes in with a box of donuts, if you got to be suspicious about their nationality, that's not a healthy situation. I hope we'd adopt the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? I yield myself 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. I oppose this amendment. While my colleagues argue that this amendment's about reducing reporting burden and protecting privacy, I'd like to remind them that the underlying bill simply requires the same level of transparency from faculty and researchers working with sensitive research that's required for all of us in Congress. Do my colleagues think it would be appropriate if a member of Congress received a gift of $25,000 from a foreign nation without disclosing it? I hope not. Transparency should not be controversial. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and support the underlying bill. With that, I yield back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the ranking member. All in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Scott? A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes. I believe you have another amendment. The clerk will report.
Remember, it's designated DSUB_01.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933 offered by Mr. Scott, Virginia, identifier DSUB_01.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to offer this democratic amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5933. Institutions of higher education have long been incubators of research and development activities that advance the scientific knowledge and competitiveness of the United States. Institutions conduct innovative, multidisciplinary research with goals to improve the economy, international competitiveness, and quality of life for individuals. Institutions collaborate with a range of international entities to advance complex research inquiries that contribute to the growth of our knowledge on an array of issues. These international partnerships allow for a diverse range of perspectives and resources that help us make bold strides in health science and technology. Due to the inherent international nature of research, institutions have a responsibility to safeguard their research and prevent unfortunate action. In turn, the federal government has a responsibility to support and monitor institutions' compliance with research security and policies. My Democratic colleagues and I remain committed to ensuring that institutions have resources to safeguard their work from undue foreign influence. And while I appreciate the majority's interest in addressing this important issue, I fear that their proposal is far too extreme and does not actually promote institutional compliance. Specifically, with such harsh fines and limited opportunities for institutions to seek guidance, I'm concerned that the changes to Section 117 of the Higher Education Act will discourage institutions from collaborating with international entities that are essential in solving important global issues. It's also concerning to see language that targets individual faculty members for their collaboration with foreign entities. We've seen in cases such as the wrongfully accused MIT faculty member that this sort of targeting can easily lead to harmful consequences rooted in xenophobia for innocent scholars. We must also strive to strike a balance between enforcing the law and fostering safe campuses for students, scholars, and faculty. Although its overly burdensome requirements, harsh penalties, and duplicities to current foreign influence requirements across federal agencies, the Deterrent Act takes a sledgehammer to a problem that needs to be addressed with a scalpel. A Democratic substitute takes a thoughtful approach to Section 117 compliance to support institutions as they evaluate and implement their research integrity and foreign influence policies. In addition to requiring the filing of annual reports for gifts and contracts from foreign entities, our bill would create a robust database at the Department of Education to hold these reports. It establishes common sense sanctions for noncompliance that allow for room to help institutions who need support scaling up their compliance work. And it establishes a single point of contact in the department to coordinate Section 117 compliance. This substitute also builds on the great work done through the implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act and the Presidential Memorandum on Government-Supported Research and Development National Security Policy guidance by aligning reporting requirements to those of other federal agencies and requiring the Secretary of Education to go through negotiated rulemaking to address key implementation of Section 117. So I urge my colleagues to support the Democratic substitute rather than the underlying bill to enhance institutions' ability to protect against foreign influence. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to speak in opposition to the amendment in the nature of a substitute for Mr. Scott. Instead of taking the threat of foreign influence seriously, this amendment is a mere slap on the wrist and includes a gaping disclosure loopholes. This is inefficient to protect our students and institutions from our worst adversaries. The amendment makes it easier for foreign sources to be undetected, doubling the threshold for contracts from $100,000 and allowing gifts under $250,000 over a 3-year span to be unreported. Bad actors will seek any possible way to avoid transparency about their attempts to harm Americans through their influence over American post-secondary education. And a strict threshold is essential to stop this from happening. The annual threshold for deterrent are simple and in line with other requirements in existing federal law, such as CHIPS, as in CHIPS. Shockingly, this amendment includes no differences from America's biggest enemies, countries of concern, and entities of concern. In my colleagues' minds, gifts from Russia and Iran are exactly the same as gifts from England. I find it alarming that my colleagues are trying to make it easier for countries of concern to find ways to influence our universities. I want to remind everyone here that Deterrent uses a tailored list of countries and individuals pulled from existing law that have proven a track record of being security threats and actively working against the United States. The Democrats' ANS also has terrible carve-outs that provide gaping loopholes for cunning adversaries. The amendment provides disclosure of names of foreign sources and the names of who at the institutions are receiving the gifts, and also exempt all clinical trials. These loopholes will make it easier for foreign sources to conceal their relationships, rendering disclosures all but useless. Simple transparency is the best way to ensure partnerships are as good as the institutions claim. Finally, Democrats provide no real incentive for schools to comply. Their fines for violations are as low as $250. After three consecutive years of violations, the Democrats' fine goes only up to the full amount of the gift. This is a laughable drop in the bucket compared to the billions in foreign checkbooks. Money talks, and institutions need to know that Section 117 cannot be ignored. We have already seen institutions fail to disclose billions in the past, and this paltry fine has no real consequences. It's time to take foreign influence seriously. I stand against this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word and speak in favor of the Democratic substitute amendment.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to speak in favor of the Democratic substitute amendment offered by Ranking Member Scott. When I look at a situation like this, I always ask the question, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and does the proposed solution adequately address the challenge? And in this case, Madam Chair and colleagues, we know the importance of the role of institutes of higher education in research and development. We understand that. We know that there's federal investments, but we also know about the investments that are made. Yes, we are concerned, of course, about foreign influence and research security. We know that the institutes of higher education have a responsibility to safeguard that research and to protect against intellectual property and intellectual property theft. However, the solution that's proposed in the underlying bill goes too far, and I think that's shown by the opposition that we received from the American Council on Education as well as the Asian American Scholar Forum. So, Madam Chair, the solution proposed in the Democratic substitute is more appropriate to address the problems we face, which is why I support the Democratic substitute amendment and oppose the underlying bill. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? Ms. Wilson?
Thank
Or do you seek recognition?
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
And Ranking Member Scott for today's markup opportunity. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
It cannot be overstated, but a college education is the surest pathway to success, especially for children of color. Those who cannot obtain the promise of higher education are locked out of our economy,
and opportunities that could await them, creating an educational class divide in our society. Our focus on this committee should be ensuring everyone can attend college and eradicating the barriers to obtaining a college education. We should be making college more affordable and more accessible, eradicating barriers to obtaining a college degree, addressing the student loan crisis, and ensuring that we foster diverse perspectives. But instead, we are wasting time to mark up bills on the Chinese Communist Party. For what? Just so Republicans can act tough on China without doing a damn thing to solve any real concerns for students. This committee needs to refocus on our core mission of helping students instead of using this committee as a stage for right-wing grandstanding through 30-second stump speeches that members will post on social media. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, the ranking member. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a roll call vote. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. There being no further amendments, we'll now be voting on the request for recorded votes that were postponed. We will now be voting on 4 amendments to the bill, H.R. 5933. The first vote will be on the amendment offered by Ms. Manning. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Ms. McLean? Ms. Steele? Ms. Miller? Mr. Estes? Ms. Lutlow? Ms. Lutlow votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Moran? Mr. James? Ms. Chavez DeReamer? Mr. Williams? Ms. Houchin? Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Wild? Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
The clerk will call the names of the members who did not answer the first time.
Mr. Wilson? Mr. Banks? Mr. Comer?
No.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Good? Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James? Ms. Chavez DeReamer? Mr. Williams? Ms. Houchin? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Sablon?
Mr. Courtney.
Mr. Courtney? Yeah. Mr. Courtney votes yes. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Takano? Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes yes. Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman?
How is Mr. Wilson recorded?
Mr. Wilson is not recorded.
No.
Mr. Wilson votes no.
How is Mr. Banks recorded?
Mr. Banks is not recorded. Mr. Banks votes no.
How is Mr. Smucker recorded?
Mr. Smucker is not recorded. Mr. Smucker votes no.
How is Ms. Chavez-DeRemer reported?
Ms. Chavez-DeRemer is not recorded. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer votes no.
How is Mr. Takano recorded?
Mr. Takano is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Takano votes aye.
Are there other members who have not been recorded on the amendment offered by Ms. Manning? How is Ms. Manning recorded?
Ms. Manning is not recorded.
Thank you. I vote aye.
Ms. Manning votes aye.
How is Ms. Stevens recorded?
Ms. Stevens is not recorded. Yes. Ms. Stevens votes yes.
Somebody's running. Nobody's running. Should we call it?
You're good at just.
Ms. McBath votes yes.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 11 yeas and 21 nays.
How is Mr. James reported?
Mr. James is not recorded. Mr. James votes no.
Okay. The clerk will report the revised tally.
Madam Chair, the revised tally is 11 yeas and 22 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The clerk will call the roll on the amendment offered by Mr. Scott. Scott underline 022. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen?
No.
Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? No. Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer?
No.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano?
Aye.
Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman?
How is Ms. Ledger-Fernandez recorded?
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez is not recorded. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes yes.
How is Mr. Burleson recorded?
Mr. Burleson is not recorded.
Burleson votes no.
Mr. Burleson votes no.
How is Mr. Sablon reported?
Mr. Sablon is not recorded. Mr. Sablon votes yes.
How is Mr. DeSaulnier recorded?
Mr. DeSaulnier is not recorded. Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye.
Are there any other members whose name has not been called?
Anybody at the door?
Okay. The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 14 yeas and 24 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is the amendment offered by Mr. Scott Threshold. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen?
No.
Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks?
No.
Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer?
No.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes aye. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman.
How is Mr. Good recorded?
Mr. Good is not recorded.
Mr. Good. How is Mr. Grothman recorded?
Mr. Good votes no. Mr. Grothman is recorded as a no.
Okay. Okay. The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 14 yeas and 24 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment to be voted on is the amendment offered by Mr. Scott. It is Scott D. Sub. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson.
No.
Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson. No. Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen.
No.
Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks.
No.
Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer.
No.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Latlow. Ms. Latlow votes no. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams. Mr. DeSaulnier.
I know.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes aye. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman. Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 14 yeas and 24 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. We'll now be voting on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mrs. Steele to H.R. 5933. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize Mrs. Steele.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 5933 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended to pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 5933 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks?
Yes.
Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer?
Yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes aye. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes aye. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes aye. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes aye. Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes yes. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jaipaul? Ms. Wild? Ms. McBath? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman?
Clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 27 yeas and 11 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. H.R. 5933 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. I got it. Neither one of us. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.